The Shroud of Turin. Out of all the religious relics in the world, the Shroud of Turin is by far the most fascinating for Christians, and it provides for many of them a strong sense of evidence for their belief. They look at the cloth, they see the image of Jesus, and that's it. There's the proof. Jesus was raised from the dead in a bright blast of light that left behind a negative image of God on a burial cloth. Well, don't get too excited. I did my homework on this, and I'm afraid I have bad news for Christians. Christians, we have a problem, a very big problem. The fourth Gospel of John describes Jesus' burial linens in detail, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, was not lying with the linen cloths, but was folded up in a place by itself. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. There you have it, my friends. Read your Bibles closely. Jesus' face was wrapped in a separate cloth that had been nicely folded up, and the other cloths, notice this is plural, meaning multiple other pieces, were just tossed to the ground somewhere. We have at minimum 3 separate pieces of cloth here. So, a Christian must choose one of 2 scenarios. Either the New Testament contains false information and cannot be trusted, or the Shroud of Turin is a fake. This is a major dilemma for Christians who are blindly swayed by this mysterious shroud. Is it mysterious? Indeed, it is, and not in a good way for Christians. One mystery is this: why does the Shroud of Turin make its first appearance in historical records around the 13th century AD? In fact, the history of the shroud from the 15th century onward is especially strong and well documented. I would expect that this shroud's history would also be recorded going all the way back to Jesus, but it instead suddenly jumps into existence 1,000 years later. To believe someone tediously cared for it, kept it from deteriorating, and successfully passed it along throughout several generations and ages without it being heard of or known by the church is ludicrous. How could Christians who hold their beliefs so sacred fail to mention a relic as grand as Jesus' burial cloth with the image of Jesus' face? Nobody should fool themselves into believing such a ridiculous idea. Furthermore, radiocarbon dating was performed on the shroud, and the results placed it in the 13th century, the exact same time the shroud first appears into history. These facts should settle the case for any believer. Either the Book of John is corrupted by containing false information, or the shroud is a fake. Is there any good reason to believe somebody would create a fake? Yes, there is. Creating such a relic would be worth a fortune. In fact, at the time this cloth entered into history, any relics of Christian heritage were highly valuable to the church, who generated great profits off of such items. The church also has a history of foolish church leaders being too honest. In the 13th century, Bishop Pierre de Arcus wrote a memorandum to Antipope Clement VII. He stated that the shroud was a forgery and that the artist had confessed. Furthermore, the church who possesses the shroud has never declared it to be authentic and has many times issued statements with reluctance to its authenticity. In 2013, Pope Francis, like his predecessors, urged the faithful to contemplate the shroud with awe, but failed to assert its authenticity, almost as if the church has known the truth and is afraid it might somehow get leaked and they will all be called frauds. Perhaps they might know something more about the shroud's true history. Maybe this is why they continually guard it from properly being analyzed or handed over to the most qualified researchers. The ability to study this object has been plagued with church drama, foul play, and in some part a strong bias to allege its authenticity. The church has never been good about allowing an honest, unbiased research. It gives just enough to enhance its credibility and holds back just enough to keep it mysterious. The church has always set up these roadblocks and limitations. In the case studies that do exist, there lies much controversy, including researchers introducing pollens and other substances to the cloth in an attempt to match its origins to the time and place of Jesus. It has been argued that the men given research access were too small in number, were amateur paleontologists, and were not properly trained for such analysis. I'm afraid it looks as though the church will forever keep us from having proper research being performed. According to the art historian Nicholas Allen, the image on the shroud was formed by a photographic technique in the 13th century. Nicholas Allen explains that these techniques were already available in the 13th century as described in the Book of Optics, which was just translated from Arabic to Latin at that time. A large white cloth was more than sufficient to produce primitive photographs, and the people familiar with these techniques would have been able to produce the image found on the shroud. Nicholas demonstrated this by successfully producing a photographic image like the shroud using only techniques and materials available in the 13th century. He described his results in a PhD thesis and published his results in several science journals. Furthermore, Nickel in 1983 and Gregory Paul in 2010 separately stated that the proportions of the image are not realistic. Gregory Paul stated that the face and proportions of the shroud image are impossible, and that the figure cannot represent a real person. They all argued that the forehead on the shroud is too small, and that the arms are too long and of different lengths, and that the distance from the eyebrows to the top of the head is non-representative of all known humans. The Shroud Center of Colorado argues that paint pigments exist on the shroud and may have come from an artist touching up the image. Fragments analyzed by U.S. McCrone and others observed the present pigment types commonly used in medieval paints on the shroud. It should be clear to anyone who takes the time to investigate without bias that the Shroud of Turin does not agree with the New Testament, appears 1,000 years late into Christian heritage, hides behind extreme church paranoia, maintains a historical confession to being a fake, and held great value to any artist who would fake such a relic. And of course, the ability to produce the shroud existed at that time.